Okay, this lecture is going to cover the second half of Rawls' The Law of Peoples. Uh, Rawls gives a little caveat when introducing non-ideal theory. He makes a cute joke that non-ideal theory is not a statement about Rawls' theory. That is not ideal, at least according to Rawls. I'll forgive him for that. Okay, so just by way of review, remember that the Law of the Peoples has kind of two stages, and each stage has two steps. The first stage dealt with the ideal world and strict compliance theory, where societies kind of comply with the law of peoples. With step one, uh, the representatives of liberal societies coming together and behind the veil of ignorance in original position and coming to an agreement on the law of peoples. And then step two, the law of peoples agreed upon being extended to hierarchical societies. The second stage is which we're looking at today deals with non-ideal theory, which again has two steps. One deals with non-compliance theory, and then the other one deals with unfavorable conditions. So we're going to look at what Rawls has to say about steps 1 and 2 as well as just the second stage as a whole. So with non-ideal theory, non-ideal theory asks how to best apply the ideal conception of society of well-ordered peoples to the non-ideal work we actually live in, which Rawls will grant is a gradual process. Now, non-ideal theory assumes that we've already worked out our ideal theory. We have something to apply to this messy world. So basically the ideal theory is a kind of a standard we can reference. And again, think of it this way. You walk into a room and things are crooked. Well, how do you know they're crooked? You have some concept of straightness in mind. Think about the real world. Like most modern architecture is just angular, right? It's constructed around right angles with straight walls. Whereas the natural world, you don't find any of that. Things are curvy, they're jagged, they're rocky, they're edgy. I mean, a cave, a forest. They're not angular like modern building materials are. Yet, we had to have had some conception of that, like right-angled straight lines, or else we wouldn't have been able to build any of the modern architecture that we enjoy. Well, and I can think of a lot of other examples or analogies as well for having some idea of the ideal world that we apply to the messy world. So Rawls isn't, completely out of mind by suggesting this. This is a very reasonable suggestion on his part. Okay. He says there are going to be two kinds of non-ideal theory. One is non-compliance. These are conditions in which certain regimes refuse to acknowledge a reasonable law of peoples, basically outlaw regimes. Contemporary politics, we would classify North Korea as an outlaw regime. The second type of non-ideal theory would involve unfavorable conditions. These are conditions of peoples whose historical, social, and economic circumstances make their achieving a well-ordered regime, whether it be liberal or non-liberal, instead hierarchical, it'd be difficult, if not impossible. It's hard to have this like democratic utopia when you don't have enough water to go around for everyone. Basic resources. So this is true of many parts of the third world today. Even if they don't have, a brutal dictator in charge, there's a lack of resources needed. Okay, so we'll start with non-compliance. According to Rawls, a reasonable law of peoples will specify the goal they should have in mind and indicate the means they may use or ought to avoid in pursuing that goal. Okay. That would be the Death Star would be an example of a bad means. He notes that outlaw regimes come in a lot of varieties, like crayons. Some have governments that have. Well, let's go back to this slide real quick. When he's talking about a reasonable law of people specifying the goal they should have in mind and indicating the means they may use or not use in avoiding that goal, that can apply to liberal or well-ordered hierarchical societies as well as non-liberal or non-well-ordered societies. What are we, I guess, in the quote-unquote liberal Western world to do with societies like North Korea that are clearly not in compliance with the law of peoples, including how they interact with other nations? North Korea is not known for their ability to get along with other countries, as well as how they treat people within their country. I don't envy any citizen that lives in North Korea right now. where they have horrible labor prison camps. There's lots of famine and scarcity. There's a media blackout. There's just a lack of human rights. Well, what would be our goals in kind of moving forward towards this ideal world, and what would be justifiable versus unjustifiable means for achieving those goals? That's kind of what Rawls is getting at. Okay, sorry, I don't think I explained that slide as well as I could have. All right, so some non-compliant governments have governments. Some non-compliant societies have governments that have absolutely no conception of right and justice with legal orders, and instead these are systems of coercion and terror. And there are societies like that today, and there have been societies like that throughout history. There are other types of outlaw regimes that scoff at being called outlaw regimes. However, the rulers affirm comprehensive doctrines that recognize no geographic limits to the legitimate authority of their religious or philosophical views. So I guess by Rawls's lights, these societies would be in denial about the fact that they're outlaw regimes. We'll leave it to your imagination to see if there are any regimes like that in this world right now. But I think you'd probably think of examples on your own. Okay, well-ordered liberal and hierarchical law-abiding societies can at least defend the integrity of their societies, according to Rawls, as the law of people allows. So we don't have to be threatened by these other societies. Said the law-abiding societies will actually have a duty to their own and to one another's societies. And according to Rawls, they also have a duty to the people subject to the outlaw regimes. Now that's interesting. We have a duty to peoples that are subjected to these outlaw regimes, according to Rawls. He thinks that's what we would agree to based on the law of peoples. So, what the law-abiding societies, however, do not have a duty to do is the rulers and elites of outlaw regimes. So we have some sort of duties to help out those in these outlaw regimes, but we don't have any duties to help out the rulers who are responsible for the oppression, contra Kim Jong-un's claims. So the duties, though, of law-abiding societies will vary, but according to Rawls, there is always a duty to consider the more extensive long-run aims and to affirm them as overall guides of foreign policy. So you gotta have the big picture in mind in various policy decisions, basically. Thus, according to Rawls, the only legitimate grounds of the right to war against outlaw regimes would be either defense of the society of well-ordered peoples and, in grave cases of innocent persons subject to outlaw regimes, and the protection of their human rights. So the law of peoples is going to bear on just war theory, okay, which is we spent a whole week looking at, but this is Rawls's version of a just war theory. So Rawls would be in the tradition of just war in this sense. He's not a pacifist, and his views of just war, well, here we are. And it's, so self-defense. And then even if, like, example, the United States isn't being threatened by another country, but the other country is engaging in a genocide against its own peoples, perhaps it's okay for the United States to step in then. So, example, a lot of people that I wouldn't take to be pro-war chicken hawks, these people, I guess, in the first decade of the 2000s, who were vehemently against, like, for example, the Iraq War, wanted the United States government to do some sort of military action in Sudan with the Darfur situation, as there was a genocide going on. So that applies to, two, right there. Okay, there's an additional requirement. To achieve the long-term aim, the law of people suggests, according to Rawls, that well-ordered societies establish a central federative center in public form. Kind of like the United Nations, but I imagine it'd be a bit more, would actually be able to accomplish stuff. The complaint about the United Nations on some people is that they're just not capable of getting anything done. And some people would prefer it that way, some people wouldn't. Some people, take advantage of that. But I think it would be more powerful than. I'm not saying the United Nations actually gets a lot done, but they don't have the power of like a governing authority. Like they don't have the power of the United States or China or Russia. Okay. So Rawls writes, gradually over time, the well-ordered peoples may pressure the outlaw regimes to change their ways. But by itself, this pressure is unlikely to be effective. It has to be backed up by the firm denial of all military aid or economic and other assistance. Nor should outlaw regimes be admitted by well-ordered peoples as members in good standing into their mutually beneficial cooperative practices. So if the outlaw regimes don't get their act together, then, well, Rawls is suggesting sanctions of some sort. Which is a common thing in foreign policy today. And he's thinking that this is justified by the law of peoples agreed upon behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. Alright, the second step of stage 2 looks at unfavorable conditions and what the law of peoples, how it applies to that. So the goal of non-ideal theory for the case of unfavorable conditions is thus, eventually each society, now burned by unfavorable conditions, should be raised to or assisted toward conditions that make a well-ordered society possible. So the main issue then is, shouldn't Rawls' difference principle apply to unfavorable conditions among societies? Oh, another point is, what is the difference principle? Well, with respect to that second question, we covered it in Rawls part 2. So I'm not going to rehearse it again. You can look it up yourself. But it has to do with distributed justice, how we do resource allocation, how we can justifiably have unequal distributions of resources. What principles dictate that? The difference of principle applies to that. But regardless, Rawls is going to say no, the difference principle actually won't apply to that, because he says there are actually various kinds of societies, and not all of them are going to accept the liberal difference principle. Okay? Well, that's it for this presentation. To wrap it up, we'll just note that Rawls considers the question of whether the liberal law of peoples is ethnocentric and merely Western. And he gives an answer to that. But before I give his answer, what do you think? Well, really, I don't care. Let's see what Rawls says first. He says, not necessarily. I do care what you think, by the way. I'm sorry, that was mean. Rawls says, not necessarily. Whether it is so, that is Western, turns on the content of the political conception that liberal societies embrace once it is worked up to provide at least an outline of the law of peoples. So he's saying, yeah, we're actually not in a position to say at this point. This is in response to an objection that we're imposing Western values on non-Western nations, I guess. So he's saying, well, it hasn't actually been established that this is Western or ethnocentric to begin with, and it's a worthy question to ask and address. Okay, he continues, it's crucial that a liberal conception of the law of peoples not ask well-ordered hierarchical societies to abandon their religious institutions and adopt liberal ones. So he says there can be cooperation with non-liberal societies, in a sense, so we won't be imposing all these Western values on them. Moreover, the liberal law of peoples does not justify economic sanctions or military pressure on well-ordered hierarchical societies to change their ways, provided they respect the rules of peace and their political institutions satisfy the essential conditions. So, basic human rights are respected, and you're not waging war with one another, and then we're not going to impose anything else. If, however, I continue the quote, these conditions are violated, external pressure of one kind or another may be justified depending on the severity and the circumstances of the case. So a concern for human rights should be a fixed part of the foreign policy of liberal and hierarchical societies. Who wouldn't want to be concerned about human rights? Well, that is all.